Hello and welcome to episode 18 of the Follycast, the Rivers of London podcast. I'm Margaret in Sutton and joining me are
Richard in Fulham.
And Jan in Worcester.
So the latest Rivers of London novel is out. 3 years after Amongst Our Weapons, we've got the 10th novel in the series called Stone and Sky. We've had two novellas, Winter's Gifts and The Masquerades of Spring, and a number of graphic novels to keep us interested in the world of the folly, or the follyverse, if we want to call it that. But you can't beat a good full-length novel to get your teeth into, and that's what we've got. So we're back, we've all read it, and we're ready to have a good chat about it. We haven't discussed our thoughts before the pod to keep things fresh, so we really don't know where the conversation will go, other than it will definitely contain spoilers. So if you haven't read it yet, it may be best to put this podcast aside for a later date. So, a quick synopsis of what happens in Stone and Sky, just in case if you're listening to this podcast at some point in the future and need a quick reminder if you read the book a while ago.
It's now 2018 and a full 2 years since Amongst Our Weapons took place, although Peter has been busy. In the graphic novel Monday Monday, there's been a werewolf attack, and in the more recent Here Be Dragons, Peter's had to dispatch a wyvern at large over London. A mysterious killing of a sheep by what seems to be a large cat in rural Aberdeenshire is discovered by Dr. Brian Robertson, a friend of folly pathologist Dr. Abdul Waleed. This results in most of the folly, related family and friends, human, fae and fox, all heading north. So it starts as a summer holiday for Beverly, Peter and their 2-year-old twins, Taiwo and Kay Hinde. But guess what? Things soon start to heat up as mysterious weird bollocks, as Peter calls them, starts to pile up. Whilst Abigail and Nightingale go large cat hunting in the woods, Peter is drafted in to investigate the murder of a man who has gills.
Abigail teams up with Ione, who's revealed to be a mermaid, to find out how the panther comes to be roaming the woods. We follow both Peter and Abigail as narrators, and their investigations and adventures start to converge. Beyond the panther, mysterious creatures, including gulls with teeth and a wyvern, are being summoned from another world. Abigail is dropped into a freezing sea by a wyvern. We have a hostage rescue from a lighthouse, a hidden base under a flooded gravel pit, and Bev and the wyvern save the day on a stormy oil rig before the oil company's evil plans are foiled. So, before we dive into some talking points, having just read Stone and Sky, what's your initial reaction, Jan?
I'm always a bit wary when we leave London because I just love it when we're in the Rivers of London world. However, in typical Ben Aronovich style, he packs the start of the book with lots of detail. So I think he immerses you in the story immediately. And so once you've got the link made between London and Scotland, I think it takes you on that journey to Scotland quite easily. And then I felt quite settled there, especially as we were in the company of all of the team virtually from London. So you felt you were with them, with all familiar faces. And then it was intriguing the way the sort of relationships grew quite quickly once they arrived in Aberdeen. So I really, really liked this book.
Yeah, I really, really liked it. I love having a novel rather than a sort of novella or a graphic novel. It's good to get your teeth into it and really explore, and the characters really start to develop, which I really, really liked. I like that most people were away, but maybe I have a slight gripe that some people had not so much to do. But I liked it being in Aberdeen. And once I got used to there being a split narration, I really, really liked that too. And it was good to have Abigail having quite a lot to do as well. It took me a while to get used to sort of the two things happening concurrently, but always knowing that they'd come together at the end somehow. But for me, it was just lovely to have all the characters and see what's going on with them all, and Peter and his family and Abigail particularly. So yeah, I really, really liked it. And I do like Foxglove Summer. That's one of my favourite books, but this one is good too. And I think also for me, it's the one of not having that book for 3 years. I was just really, really lovely to be immersed in the whole folly world. So yes, I enjoyed it.
I liked it. I liked it a lot. I wouldn't say it's my favorite. I think that I've got a few, I wouldn't say issues because it's always awful when fans say, "Oh, I've got issues with this," because it implies you're somehow better at writing books than the author, and you're really not. But overall, the plot I particularly like because it's a sort of plot that I'm very familiar with. I was intrigued by it, but I wasn't confused by it. Sometimes when you have so many things up in the air that you can hit a point in the book where you think there's too much going on, I don't know what's happening, and I don't care what's happening. Whereas in this, just about the right balance between being intriguing but not being confusing, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Right, so we've talked about it being totally out of London. So what do we think about Aberdeen as a location?
Yes, definitely. Yes. I think the way where the story took place and the locations and, you know, the fact that they were talking about the granite and everything, I felt it really, really set it very clearly in Aberdeen. I felt a really strong sense of place. To me, it sounded as if lots and lots of genuine research had been done. So he wasn't just making these places up. I know that, you know, he was using obviously the right of a fiction writer to create, you know, his own places, but it obviously rooted them in a lot of real genuine knowledge of the place.
I think he had been doing obviously a lot of traveling up to Aberdeen, which won't have been easy. Funny if we might refer to it a couple of times, but we went to one of the book launch events in London, and in that someone asked, "How do we know what year this is set in?" And he said, "Ah, well, you can tell that because the restaurant they visit in one scene isn't there anymore." So clearly he's been up a few times. I think he was actually up there a couple of days ago for a book signing up there as well. But have either of you been to Aberdeen?
No, never.
Vaguely.
Vaguely.
Vaguely, yes. I have arrived in Aberdeen. I have got on a boat to Lerwick, which is up to the Shetland Islands. I've come back to Aberdeen. So I remember the granite. I remember it being very grey and all the buildings being very grey and it being absolutely freezing, even though it was summer. But apart from that, no. So I was quite intrigued. I remember when we interviewed him, he talked about this gravel pit that he found amazing that was in a suburb of Aberdeen, and him saying that's going to come into the story, and that's quite significant as we get through the book. I also feel sometimes we in previous books go on about Peter's knowledge of architecture, and sometimes that's a bit too much, but in this book I don't think it mattered at all, because you wanted to get a sense of like the historic harbour like Footdee and the lighthouses, and the forest could have been anywhere, but all the stuff connected to the city and all along the sea and like the lighthouse and everything else like that. I felt, as Jan says, like a really good sense of place, that I knew this was fairly realistic to what Aberdeen actually was, even down to things like the macaroni cheese pie and stuff like that. So you had the whole sort of cuisine and culture as well, which I really, really liked.
Yeah, I used to go to Aberdeen quite a lot in the 1990s because the company I worked for did reader research for the P&J, the Press and Journal, which is the evening newspaper in Aberdeen. So we'd be in their offices, and they used to have a series of free newspapers as well for different parts of Aberdeenshire. But I haven't been back since probably about 93, 94. So I couldn't really claim to have recent knowledge of it. The only thing this might slightly overlap with something we're going to talk about is we used to fly. It was an hour and a half from Heathrow, whereas I think their 20-hour road trip the Folly team had to get up there, driving up from London. I found that, I mean, there may be a reason, obviously, why they didn't fly, but it just seemed a bit bizarre that they were all heading up en masse, 20 hours there and 20 hours back, but particularly with 2-year-old kids and all sorts of things in tow. But we'll talk a bit more about that element of it, because that's what I did struggle a bit with, that element.
All of our favourite characters, bar a couple, apart from Molly and Toby, and probably a couple others that we can name, all decamp.
Leslie.
Leslie,
Leslie.
yes. Well, of course, Leslie. There's no mention of Leslie at all at any point in the book, but pretty much everybody that we care about in Peter's family and the Folly went to Aberdeen on the basis they found a dead sheep that had been mauled by a big cat, and it took them about 6 months to do that. So anyway, let's sort of talk a little bit more about how it starts in the plot.
Well, it didn't fully explain why they were all going en masse, apart from the fact that they were going on holiday. But, you know, the fact that Nightingale, Peter, Bev, that they were all going. And then as the story went on, I then thought, well, was it also because they're all very concerned now about Abigail's state of mind? Did they think, right, we'll scoop her up and we'll go off on this adventure to see what's going on? But yeah, I think I was invested because we'd got so much information and I felt he was a reliable character, this doctor from Aberdeen, but I didn't quite understand the gap between him knowing and then reacting to finding out.
And he's a very hospitable man as well, because they didn't even call him, they all just turned up.
Yeah, in their tents and camper vans.
Yeah, I get your point about Abigail there, because but you don't know that until about page 60, do you?
No, exactly.
Because obviously her brother's died and she's still grieving, and it's like Nightingale sort of particularly looking after her. But what about the actual plot itself? Did it all, once we got them all up there, did that sort of work?
It did, and I agree with Richard in that it did sort of evolve in a fairly clear way, in the sense that, so I think it was done well, but it did leave me at certain points thinking, I'm not quite sure I'm getting what's going on here. But then when you got to a certain point along the way, I think it started, it did make sense.
The overall plot I enjoyed. I think he's been talking about this book being set in Aberdeen, even in the publicity for False Value, if I remember correctly. That there would be a book based in Aberdeen. So we had a fair amount of time to think about what that might involve. The three things I assumed it would involve would be oil rigs, selkies, and somehow the Loch Ness Monster. And we got two of those plus a reference to the third. But I think I may have had an early advantage in understanding some of the plot, because one of my favorite musicians is a guy called Erlen Cooper, a young sort of electronic composer who is based in Orkney. And he did a series of 3 albums. And one of the features of that was him interviewing local people about folklore. And there's people talking about the Selkies coming out of the sea and living amongst the humans. So when the guy was revealed in the mortuary to have gills, I very self-righteously said, aha, a Selkie. I think that also helped, in my mind, which might have got slightly confusing, distinguish them from the mermaids, the Fae who were mermaids, that they were not the same basic creatures, that they were different things. And that kind of goes back to, I think there's Elric, who I think, is he one of the river gods up there?
He is, yeah.
He says at one point, this isn't London, the rules are different up here, and so are the allegiances. And that's, I guess, one of the points that Jan was making, that it's encountering a slightly different world where we know how things work in London, or at least we think we know how the Folly interacts with the river gods who interact with the Fae, who, that's established. Whereas here, it's a fairly fundamental plot point that actually, in this case, some of the Fae are colluding with the oil company to use the Selkies as, forced labour, as it were, to keep the oil rigs afloat, seemingly with the collusion of the Scottish government. I would echo Margaret's point that I can get over it, but it takes a leap of faith to accept that all of the cast would move up to Aberdeen en masse in that way. There are various reasons given, such as Beverly's mum and dad were there to look after the kids, but when it came to a critical point, it was actually one of the policeman's partners, I think, who looked after the kids. So I'm not quite sure why they were all there en masse. Funny enough, I was talking to Richard, who is one of the musicians on our soundtrack, the band Cutwater, who do London is Inspired, which is our theme tune. And I said, "Oh, the new book's out." And I said, "What?" He said, "What's it about?" And I said, "Oh, well, they all the cast move up to Aberdeen." He said, "Oh, is it like Holiday on the Buses?" And there used to be this thing that often sitcoms in the UK would get made into films, and they'd come up with some torturous reason why they all had to go on holiday together, so they could then take the cameras off to Torremolinos and all have fun. So he also said, "Can you ask Ben Aronovich if he's ever seen Holiday on the Buses?" But we didn't. There's a few Doctor Who references in there to Peter Capaldi and Daleks, which I noticed, but I'd probably argue the biggest Doctor Who reference, and if listeners are playing the Doctor Who drinking game, which is at what point will Richard mention Doctor Who, then this is the point where you take your drink. But I'd say that the plot is something of a tribute to Doctor Who, because it was a staple, particularly of John Pertwee Doctor Who, that seemingly monsters would be up to no good, only to find out that the monsters were reacting to something that the government or evil capitalists were doing that was disturbing their natural lairs. I mean, if you've ever seen the Sea Devils or the Silurians, there is a lot of similarity there, where the Doctor usually ends up giving some speech to a government official saying, "You're messing with forces you just don't understand, man." So that's probably why I enjoyed it so much. So you both mentioned it earlier, but what did we think about the narration being split between Peter and Abigail? This is the first novel that Peter hasn't narrated all the way through. Were you surprised? Did it work?
I knew, because we'd been to the talk, that this was going to happen. Whereas I don't think Jan knew that was going to happen at all. So I didn't know how it was going to work, or whether it would be like sometime you read a novel and it mirrors and it splits down the middle and you have one character going all the way through it, and then the other character is their perspective of what actually happened. But it wasn't. It was more like, I'm not saying Abigail had the B scene, because she didn't, but basically it was set up that premise, and then Abigail veers off, and then you have chunks of chapters for each character, for Abigail and Peter, rather than going backwards and forwards all the time. It's like 2 or 3 chapters and then 2 or 3 chapters of Peter. I think it did work. I mean, I am a big fan of Abigail, so I like that. Although it did mean that Peter had slightly less to do, but that's fine. Eventually you start to realise that it is all connected. Much once I got used to the structure of it, I was fine. Jan, you may have another opinion about that, but I was pleased that Abigail had a lot of stuff to do.
Yeah, I did check at the end, and I saw that I think she had 9 chapters and Peter had 13.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that uneven. But yeah, I was surprised, because I thought, as soon as I realised it was going to be split, I thought, as you say, it might be alternate chapters or not, but it just suddenly, Abigail sort of popped up every now and again. I did think that there was a different sort of tone. And at first I thought, oh, is this just going to be a sort of teenager's description of things, and it's all going to be a bit lighthearted and fun? Obviously, I knew that, her brother had died, so she was very sad. But there was still lots of humour in there. And I thought the fact that he introduced the Ione romance carried that along a bit. So it didn't make what Abigail was clearly going through way too heavily on the book. And I suppose it also explained, because I did miss Nightingale. I would have liked more of Nightingale.
So much, yes.
Yeah. But I think that almost explained it, that he was almost saying, no, I'm going to give Abigail time to, I'm going to keep an eye on her and sort of support her as she's going through this grief. But I'm also, going to give her sort of free rein to make some mistakes, but also hopefully make some good choices. So you saw her in action, you saw her growing, and I felt as if she was like a fully formed character in her own right by the end. And there was lots of sort of silliness, which I thought was appropriate because of Peter had got the responsibility of his children there, and he's also working with Blinshall, and he's got keep an eye on Bev because she's going to go off and do things to help and do things that he's not capable of doing. So there was a lot going on there. Whereas I thought that, Abigail was trying to be responsible, but she'd also got this little flirtation going on. And I loved Indigo.
So the relationship with Indigo was lovely.
Yeah, the character there was again, a long way of saying it all, but I think it did work.
Yeah, I thought it worked very well. I had my doubts because I wasn't a fan of what Abigail did last summer. I mean, as you know, I didn't hate it, but it just wasn't my sort of thing, really. But it did seem to be, obviously, an older Abigail. So she still uses the slang words like chirpsing and looking drip and prang and bear and stuff like that. But you can work out what they mean from the context. But the main advantage to me was I've talked before about the fact that these books are great because Peter's the narrator. That works brilliantly, but it is a limitation when you're doing mystery plots because unless Peter sees it, someone has to explain it to him after it's happened. So in this context, you could have two things going on in parallel at the same time without having to, have some convoluted way of Peter finding out about them, which worked very well. And also it meant you could switch from one narrative to the other and wonder what was happening when you went back. If you read the Slow Horses books by Mick Herron, for example, he has 4 or 5 point of view characters and they're forever switching between them just at points when it gets exciting. So I think that's something that the more linear nature of Peter as the only narrator can lose sometimes. You mentioned the styles, Dan, that you found the styles slightly different. Did you pick up on the fact that Abigail was speaking in the present tense and Peter was speaking in the past tense?
I must admit, I hadn't thought of that, no.
I only picked up on it because I think, didn't he say at the launch, Margaret, that he was never going to write in the first person again? Or that
Yes,
was
no, he found it really hard and he had to ask his son and stuff as well, didn't he, about what she might say and stuff like that. I think the other interesting thing about Abigail being in the book at the same time as Peter, but you also get Abigail's perception of other characters, not just Peter's. So like her relationship with Beb and her relationship with Nightingale, it's somebody else giving you context around other characters that we like that's not just Peter's perspective. And I found that quite interesting because she's got a good relationship with Bev going on, hasn't she? So
yeah. The other thing he said at the launch tour was that he had been experimenting with writing Leslie in the first person, which I was quite intrigued with because I think it would be really interesting to have a book with Peter and Leslie as the split narrators, perhaps, one of those he said, she said type
that's
scenarios. That would be really interesting. I think he more or less implied she will be in the next one, having confirmed to everyone that she's not in this one, but
it's not, doesn't get a single word. There's nothing about her or what happens at the end because it's 2 years later.
yeah,
It doesn't have to do that because most of the other books not quite pick up what the other novel left, but there's not such a bigger gap in between. But there's no reference to Leslie or anything else that happened in Amongst Our Weapons, apart from some of the characters like Danny Whitford.
Okay, well, we've got a lot of characters we know already, and then we've got potentially new characters to talk about. But other than people we've mentioned, what did all the other holidaymakers bring or not bring to the story?
Well, Lead has very little to do, but he's there, and occasionally he's linked. He and Brian. We know very little about Brian actually, apart from at the very beginning as well. I know he's not, but he's connected to a lead. I love Nightingale, and I would like to have had a bit more. He is there at relevant times. He's important in the denouement, which we'll talk about in a bit. And I think Abigail appreciates that he is there to guide her and support her, and that he's keeping a watchful eye of her because he is aware, like Peter, that she's going through grief and needs time. Peter's mum, dad, and the band, I have no idea why they're there. It's nice. She cooks. She has a few things to do. The band play occasionally. It's somewhere for Peter to go. And Zach has very little to do apart from ponce on somebody's house that they stay in and slice through a lock through his magic at the end. So from that perspective, of all of those, Nightingale has slightly more to do. And there's lots of other characters referenced as well, which you'll pick up later on. It's almost like Peter and Abigail have their wingmen and people outside the Folly, and we'll come on to those in a moment. The two people that they work with the closest have the relationship with new characters. Beverly, I think, is important. Beverly has stuff to do, and the twins are important. We learn a little bit about the twins and their characters and their toddlers, and that's what toddlers do. But Beverly is important in terms of you see a bit more about her relationship with Peter and her being a mother, and through what she says, her interaction with Peter. And also she is important in terms of she's looking after Abigail as well. And she has quite a bit of interaction with Abigail. But also she's really important in terms of what happens at the end and being involved in actually stopping the explosion on the oil rig. So I think Beverly is important, and you see more of Beverly not as a side to the main story, but actually has an important sort of thread running through it, which she's never really had apart from in Foxglove Summer. So I'm a big fan of Bev. So that was really, really good. And I think as the book went on, she became more and more important. But the rest of the crew didn't have too much to do, I have to say.
I agree with Margaret about Bev. I thought the fact it was made very clear, apart from the role that she had as Peter's partner and mother, it was obvious all the skills that she had that the others didn't have, so that she could check things out, obviously go under the water. And I thought the links back to London, saying, look, I know I have to be wary here because here it's the sea, it's not the river, and it's a different environment. Beverly was quite prominent, even though she wasn't in it massively. I thought the times that she appeared, it was quite significant, and she had a clear, distinct role. And she's obviously highly intelligent and very, very gifted, and so was definitely needed throughout the story. And I think Peter relies on her a lot. And also, you know, when she went down, you know, below the surface, I thought then it came out, you know, Peter was able to say, you know, how upset he was, and you know, that he might have lost her. And then I thought, so her role was there. We saw that side to Peter, but also then that opened up communication with Nightingale. And he was talking about Nightingale, about how do you deal with loss? And Nightingale was able to say, you know, I don't really, I just sort of get on with it. So I thought that was, you know, Beverly was quite significant, and she clearly spotted, you know, Ione and the relationship, and the fact that she was looking out for Abigail. So I felt that Bev had got eyes and ears everywhere, even though she wasn't in it as much as some of the other characters.
What do we think about the new characters? Both Peter and Abigail, their second person character wasn't somebody from the Follycast. So Peter had Martin Blinchell, DS detective from Aberdeen Police, and obviously Abigail had Ione. So what do we think about these two new characters?
Ione, I got a very clear picture of her straight away, I suppose, because there was this figure carrying a spear, quite fierce, on the hunt for a panther. So she made quite an entrance. And then very rapidly, it became clear that Abigail was attracted to her. And so you were sort of on the lookout then after that for this budding romance, whether it was going to be reciprocated or not, for a little while. But then the relationship developed pretty quickly. And then I thought they were a very good team. And then once we understood that Ione was a mermaid, again, like Bev, you then realised the sort of powers that would come with her. Blinchel, I thought that was more of a slow burn, and he was a sort of stereotypical image that you have of a doer detective that's thinking, this is our patch and what are you doing here? But also being very responsible and saying, you know, right, we'll come and help you. I thought they were plausible, credible relationships, and you could see the difference between the older, you know, the detectives, Peter and Martin Blinchel, and then this very excitable romance that was going on between Abigail and Ione. So I thought they both worked well.
I agree about Ione. I thought she was very well defined, and I'm sure will pop up.
Yeah.
Probably literally in the Thames at some point in the future. I think, in contrast to Foxglove Summer, where it was largely Peter as a stranger in a strange land, where we got to know quite a few different characters, and a couple of them went on to be in one of the short stories, if you remember. I think, apart from Ione, I didn't really get to know really any of the other characters. I mean, Blinchel was there as a companion and someone for Peter to speak to in the absence of Nightingale or Abigail, but I didn't really get a feeling for him at all. And if Jenny was around, sadly she's not, but if Jenny was around, I think it was amongst our weapons where she was complaining there were like 28 new characters with names. I think she would have been making that point, but also possibly that I don't think every character needs to have a name, particularly when we got on the oil rig. Everyone needed to have a name and a quick summary of who they were. And initially I thought, why are we being force-fed so many names? On the other hand, there is quite an important reference, I think, to Peter being a builder of networks, and whether it's that's what Peter does. Yeah, I'm really crap at remembering people's names. I get introduced to someone at a party and it goes in one ear and out the other. Whereas I suspect Peter is very good at remembering people's names and building those networks. So perhaps, yeah, it's Peter's narration that is making, everyone's got a name and a background and where they're from, but it can get quite bewildering at times for someone like me who's almost name blind. It's tricky, but yeah. So I think that would be the main contrast with Foxglove Summer, is that a lot of the people, even the evil uncle, was just the evil uncle. I don't think we knew much about him at all, other than he was her uncle and he was evil. But perhaps I'm being unfair.
I agree with you both on Ione. I think I found her a complex character to start off with because she was wary and she knew something was going on, and she wasn't complicit, but also she was wary of her uncle. And I liked the way that she got on board and how that sort of developed, and how eventually she was important in saving like Abigail's life and stuff like that. So I thought that was good. In defense of Martin Blinchard, I thought he was quite nice. I love the fact that he wore, was it a stab vest? I thought there's some nice touches about describing him.
Yeah.
And also he was he did a lot of the grunt work. So I think Peter appreciated him. So he was a copper's copper in the sense that he did his research, he connected the dots and he could see things. And I think he was quite important when it got to the end of being on the oil rig as well. So I think he had a role. Does that make sense? I don't think he didn't. I agree with you that there was too many people described at the autopsy. And there were so many people involved in that. And I just thought, I don't need all of that. There's about 6 different characters. And like, well, who is it going to be? And in the end, it wasn't McLean. It was Blinchard that became his partner.
Yeah, and they all get listed in order, don't they, with names?
Yeah. You didn't need that. But I think potentially to him have this connection, like he has that connection with Dominic in the Cotswolds, there was a genuine relationship between them. So I think that's why I quite liked him. But obviously you didn't find anything more about him apart from he was a cop that had been there a number of years and then very quickly supported Peter and was prepared to believe in all the things that were happening. Yeah, and I think Ione has potential and is an interesting character. And obviously, as a young woman with being a mermaid and everything else, working with a difficult family in a difficult situation and not being aware of the how complicit her uncle was in all what was actually happening.
Yeah. And she was terrified of him, wasn't
She
she?
was. She was
That
definitely
nerves
terrified of
you
him.
to
Yeah.
the fact that, he wasn't just this benign character. He's going for Abigail at one point, isn't he? And
Yes.
she sort of spins Abigail out of the
Yeah,
way
exactly.
to protect her. So he's obviously, heavily involved. As she knows her family are involved, but she doesn't quite know all the ins and outs. And I thought an interesting thing from the Folly was the fact that, they hadn't really investigated summonings before, because they just thought, that was demonology, I think they described it as, and they thought that was beyond the pale, so that wasn't their area. So I thought that was, I think it's little things like this that, always make me smile, that Ben Aronovich will sort of throw these details in.
Okay, well, moving on, what did we think about the foxes? Talking about details, I love the little headsets that they had.
Yeah, the technology they were able to use.
So what do we feel about the role the foxes played? But obviously Indigo's a major role, but there are some Scottish foxes involved too.
Yeah. I'm going to be controversial, perhaps. I always find the foxes hugely annoying. And I don't know why they're in the books. And that probably is putting me as an outlier. I'm certainly going on the love for foxes on some of the Rivers of London Facebook groups. Having said that, though, I thought they worked really well in this book. And actually, this is the first one when I thought, actually, I'm quite liking the foxes. I don't know why. I think it may be because we got far more about the lead fox.
Oh, Indigo.
Yeah, we've got far more characterization of Indigo and her sort of protectiveness of Abigail. And as you say, the little details like the fact that they can use technology, but they can't type. So they need voice activation headphones and stuff like that. Yeah, so I guess the foxes have grown on me. Strangely, when I was out for a walk this afternoon, I bumped into a fox. So perhaps they know I'm now okay with them. It's just as well because I'm going to predict that the foxes are going to play a huge role in the next novel, because it's going to be, he confirmed, set during the pandemic or around the pandemic. And of course, the foxes will have London almost to themselves, won't they? That's going to be really interesting to see what the foxes get up to. We'll probably find out that it was them that was running London while everyone was stuck inside. But
you said about finding out more about Indigo, the fact that she was obviously put out and felt a bit neglected by Abigail, when she could see that Abigail was off with Ione. And obviously Indigo had, very warm feeling towards Nightingale, which seemed to be reciprocated. So you had a sense that, very sweet qualities of Indigo.
There's some lovely things in it that are just quite, like, they play an important role when Ione is scratched on her back and she's bleeding, and Abigail hasn't got enough equipment to actually deal with the fact she needs stitches. The foxes know a convenient vet who they talk to.
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting. And also they play an important role in getting into the tunnels and doing surveillance.
Yeah.
At the end as well. And then obviously there's the fact that Ione and Abigail will probably stay in touch. Ione's going to university, but also Indigo's going to have some kits. And Abigail talks about, well, she'll have to bring the kits up to see their dad.
It was made clear, wasn't it, that Indigo and Abigail's life would still be in London, and Sax William and Ione would be in Scotland, but obviously that they'll be travelling backwards and forwards. So there's lots of scope for adventures and a place for Aberdeen in the future, perhaps.
Now, there were lots of Easter eggs, as they're called, for long-term fans, both in terms of references to past novels and past characters, but also to the novellas and the graphic novels. Were there any that we particularly enjoyed?
There were lots of calling on characters, like Danny Wickford at the Folly, Kimberly Reynolds had a phone call. There was references to Monday Monday. And obviously we knew Peter's dad had a heart attack. We now know that Post Martin and the librarian from the British Library are an item, which you don't know if you read the short story about the British Library.
Yeah, that's from one of the tales from the Folly, isn't it?
Yeah, what else do we find out? The big thing is about Richard and I have read Here Be Dragons, which Jan hasn't.
I was going to ask Jan, what did you make of all the repeated references to this past adventure with dragons and wyverns over London?
Yeah, I did have to think, right, the wyvern, what's the wyvern? I just had to go with that because I wasn't really sure about this bit with the wyvern over London, I have to say.
I mean, did you assume it was like the incident in Kew Gardens, that it was something that we hadn't seen, or did you assume it must have been in one of the graphic novels you hadn't read?
I thought it had been in something that I hadn't read because it seemed to be not a great surprise to, to the other characters. They were referring to it as if they knew what it was. So I thought this must be something that I'd missed out on.
I was going to say Abigail refers to Simon, so if you hadn't actually read what Abigail did that summer, which is a novella, and Simon is the boy in the house close to Hampstead Heath. He's now off climbing. And she also refers to a civil servant I know, and she speaks to them in a certain way that a civil servant would speak, and that's Simon's mother. So again, you wouldn't know any of that had you not read that novella.
Yeah.
It's strange. I don't know why I differentiate between the two, but to me, references to novellas is fine. You can choose whether to read them or not. But I'd wager that the audience to the graphic novels,
Yeah.
although they're very popular as graphic novels, obviously because there's like 13 of them or something. I reckon there's a pretty small proportion of the readers of the books I also read the graphic novels. So referring, 7 or 8 times to the same graphic novel on some fairly key plot points, some of which are, it's all explained. Jan's confirmed that it didn't stop her enjoying the book. I just found it interesting that, we'd had odd references to cars that have been possessed and things like that, but not to this degree. And also, it wasn't written by Ben Aronovich. The one we're referring to, which is called Here Be Dragons, was written by James Swallow. He's a really good writer, by the way, but probably, as we were speculating too, some guidance from Ben. But you're at a big advantage if you've read that particular graphic novel, because not least at the back of it, there's a whole page of explanation of the history of wyverns and also a page about the history of the MPAS. And that's referred to in the book without explaining what it is, which is the National Police Air Service, because a lot of that graphic novel is set in the skies over London. The other reference that you may not have picked up on is that this is when Abigail's falling towards the sea. She recalls that she's been trained in a spell to break her fall. I think she panics and doesn't manage it in time, but she does reference to Peter using it to stop a helicopter crashing in London. Again, that's a scene from Here Be Dragons. So I have to say that it would have made a great novel, Here Be Dragons. And if anyone's listening who hasn't come across it, I definitely recommend it, even if you don't like graphic novels. But I guess the reason it's a graphic novel is because of all the wonderful pictures of dragons fighting helicopters over Big Ben, which probably wouldn't come across as well just as a written prose. It's a good example of what I think he was saying when we interviewed him, that they can do things in the graphic novels that they can't do in the books. But I think they must really like that one, because presumably they're hoping that people will go off and investigate, given it played such a key role.
Did you get the 2 references to Masquerades of Spring, which were lovely?
I did, yes. There was one to, wasn't there one to Nightingale in a Dress?
Yes.
And then there was a reference to a Beauregard's Guide to New York or something like that, wasn't
That I only was reading in the library. I was reading when she met Abigail, which I thought was rather interesting. There is a short, if you get a Waterstones book that's signed, apparently, there is a short story to do with Beauregard.
Strangely, Margaret did get the book from Waterstones at the launch, but it didn't have the extra chapter, so boo.
Boo-hoo.
Boo-hoo.
As to sort of round out our discussion, what things did you most enjoy about the novel?
I did really enjoy the relationship between Abigail and Ione because I thought that was a real character development, seeing her growing up, also emerging from grief and finding some joy. I liked the political thing running through it with the search for oil, and it was horrific that they've got these baby selkies below the water, trapped and having to slave away. Working there. And I loved the fact that it was a big dramatic, rescue at the end. So those were some of my highlights. I loved all the bits with Bev and Peter and the family as well. And the summoning of these creatures I found very intriguing. It took us on quite a journey, and I felt that we went full circle. They all came together very well at the end. It had a very satisfying ending with the rescue.
What did I most enjoy? I like the fact actually it was in Aberdeen. I like Peter, I like Bev, I like Abigail. I like the general tone of the story. It became quite menacing towards the end, the whole purpose of it about the oil company, as Richard mentioned before, and about the exploitation of the Selkies. And it has some resolution, but there is slight dark undertone at the end with that discussion with him and Andrew Ray from the Scottish Executive. Yes, he's a networker, and yes, he's important, but people are keeping their eye on him. And there was also a reference from a tiny character called Vance at the horse fair, basically saying that people in other countries are looking to the folly and thinking about how they can use for power as opposed to for good. So yes, it got resolved, and there was a nice sort of payoff at the end with Abigail leaving and them going back to London. But at the same point, you do wonder about the Andrew Ray and the Scottish Executive and what role he might continue to do, regardless of the fact that he was complicit in all of this.
Yeah, I think overall I've said that I really enjoyed it. I always do. No, even after 10 books, 5 novellas, a dozen or so graphic novels, there's still lots to explore in it. Okay, well, what would we like to see next in the Rivers of London universe? I think we've confirmed that the next release will be a novel. Where are we? And were there any clues, do you think, in the book as to what might be happening next, other than presumably the pandemic? Given the timing of this book, the pandemic is on the horizon.
Well, I'd like to see Leslie.
I'd like to see more of Nightingale in the next one.
Yes, true.
Even if it's going to be a last hurrah, because I did miss him in this book. I think you're right, Richard. You've already mentioned about the foxes. I think that if it's going to be sort of set in the pandemic, I think that could be intriguing, especially as we've got more into the characters of the foxes now. So, and I think perhaps the relationship developed between Ione and Abigail. I think we'll perhaps see more of that, or whether that's just going to fade away.
Or do you think also that Abigail's going to play, now she's an adult, will actually play a more major role to a lesser extent than Nightingale? And then my other query is, both at the end of False Values and Amongst Our Weapons, there is a bit of unfinished business lurking around, isn't there? This is almost like not quite on the buses, but it's very much we're out of London, we're doing this, what seems to be a problem that's related to Aberdeen, and then we're going to come back to London. So either we start from a standing point of something new, or it's connected to this novel, or there's something else that's bigger that's coming on the horizon. There's no mention to, because it's 2 years later, there's no mention of Leslie or anything else that's happened in the last 2 novels, apart from references to characters like Danny Wickford and various other people like that. Richard, what do you think?
I'm going to say my other controversial opinion, having probably annoyed listeners by admitting I didn't get the foxes, although I'm warming to them. I want one of the characters to die. Perhaps because my other reading obsession at the moment has been the Slow Horses novels, where characters are introduced and then do die, which brings in a lot of jeopardy because you're never quite sure who's going to make it through each book. At this stage, all the cast turn up in Aberdeen, all the cast go home safely. And I know it's reassuring that you know that no one's going to die, but someone should do at some point, surely.
Oh,
Isn't that an awful thought? But I don't, perhaps I should rephrase it. I don't want people to die, but we haven't really had a shock on the level of Leslie betraying Peter on top of a tower block in East London in volume
so,
4.
yeah.
A oh my God moment. I must read the next book now moment. And something shocking would be good. Does that make me sound really crass? I don't know, but
No, you just want a bit of excitement.
I mean, it is exciting, but it's exciting again in a TV Doctor Who way, and that the characters, our heroes, are going to make it through. But even Doctor Who companions have died sometimes.
We'll see whether that follows through into the next book.
Losing us listeners, I'm sure. I say that.
No.
They could just kill Zach. No one would care.
We had nothing to do. We wouldn't have noticed. We wouldn't have known, would we?
Yeah, there'd be a few unopened doors, but apart from that, there wouldn't be anything missing, would there?
So that's what we thought of Stone and Sky.
If you've enjoyed the podcast, please send us feedback by email at follypodcast@gmail.com or leave a comment on our website, follycast.com. Please do rate us on your app or podcast provider of choice, because that means more people will discover the podcast, because that's how the algorithm works, unfortunately. Of course, if you didn't enjoy the podcast, please don't leave us a review. The Follycast theme that you've been hearing is London is Inspired by Cutwater, and links to their site are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.